Cool, Matt or Mike says. Rock country? Zaz? Country, my dad says, which is nothing to scoff at, boys. Dude, we know, total respect, man. And when our band looked into getting a demo made, it was astronomically expensive. That was in a big city, where there was a little competition. Getting a demo made around here? I didn't even know there was a facility. Matt and Mike are still grinning. There's not. So where'd you go? And how'd you afford it? My mother whacks him under the table again. So he says, I'm just curious, Patsy. Matt and Mike lean in. We did it ourselves. This right here? You did this yourselves? That's impossible. He is looking almost mad about it. How'd you get the gear? My mom kicks him again, but Dad turns on her and says, Stop it, would you? I'm just curious. Matt or Mike says, It's cool, Mrs. Losky. He smiles at my dad and says, We kept cruising the internet and the trade's looking for a deal. Everyone's blowing out their old analog gear for digital because that's the move everyone else has made. Digital. If you want to know our opinion, it's weak. You lose too much of waveform. There's not enough fat to it. And obviously we like it beefy. My granddad puts up a finger and says, but a city's digital, so exactly. But that is the last and only step we'll compromise. We'll compromise on. It's just the necessity of being part of the industry. Everyone wants CDs, but the multi-track and the mix down to 2-track is analog, and we could afford it, Mr. Losky, because we got used gear and we've been saving up our pennies since we were 12 years old. He grins and says, "You still play? We could, lay down some of your tunes if you want." My dad looks down, and for a second I couldn't tell if he was going to get mad or cry. Then he sort of snorts and says, "Thanks, but that's not me anymore." Which was probably the only honest thing my dad said all night. After that he was quiet. He'd try to plaster up a smile now and then, but man, underneath it he was brooding. And I was feeling kind of bad for him. Was he thinking about the good old days playing in a band? I tried picturing him in cowboy boots and a cowboy hat, with a guitar strapped across his shoulder, playing some old Willie Nelson song. He was right. It just wasn't him. But the fact that it ever had been made me feel even more like a stranger in a strange land. Then, when the night was over and the bakers were peeling out the front door, something else strange happened. Julie touched my arm, and for the first time that night she was looking at me. It was that look too, channeled directly and solely at me. She says, "I'm sorry I was so angry when you first came in. Everyone had a good time, and I think your mom's really nice for inviting us." Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. I just stood there like a moron, staring at her. "Bryce," she says, touching my arm again. "Did you hear me? I'm sorry." I managed a nod, but my arm was tingling, and my heart was pounding, and I felt myself pulling toward her. Then she was gone, out the door and into the night, part of a chorus of happy goodbyes. I tried to catch my breath. What was that? What was wrong with me? My mother closed the door and said, "There. Now what did I tell you? That is one delightful family. Those boys are nothing like I expected, Lunetta. Why didn't you tell me they were so charming?" "They're drug dealers is what they are." Everyone turned to my father and dropped their jaws. "What?" My mother said. "There is no other way those boys could afford to buy recording gear like that." He glared at Lunetta. "Isn't that so?" Lunetta's eyes looked like they were gonna pop right out of her head. "Ray, please," my mother said. "You can't just make accusations like that." "It's the only thing that makes sense, Patsy. Believe me, I know how musicians are. There is no other explanation for this. Lunata shouted. I happen to know for a fact that they don't use or deal. Where do you get off saying something like that? You're such a two-faced, condescending, narrow-minded jackass. There was a split second of silence, and then he slapped her, smack, right across the cheek. That put my mother in his face like I'd never seen and sent my sister screaming in search over her shoulder as she ran down to her room. My heart was pounding. Lunetta was right, and I almost got in his face too, and told him so. But then my granddad pulled me aside, and we both retreated to our own little corners of the house. Pacing around my room, I had the urge to go talk to Lunetta, to tell her that she was right, that was way out of line. But I could hear her through the walls, crying and screaming while my mom tried to calm her down. Then she stormed out of the house to who knows where, and my mom took up with my dad again. So I stayed put, and even though the earth quit quaking around 11 o'clock, there were tremors out there. I could feel them. As I lay in my bed staring out the window at the sky, I thought about how my dad had always looked down on the Bakers, how he'd put down their house and their yard and their cars and what they did for a living, how he'd called them trash and made fun of Mr. Baker's paintings. And now I was seeing that there was something really cool about that family. All of them. They were just real. And who are we? There was something spinning wickedly out of control inside this house. It was like seeing inside the baker's world had opened the windows into our own. And the view was not a pretty one. Where had all this stuff come from? And why hadn't I ever seen it before?